The year I was the poorest, I sold myself to Ernie Traynor for $300,000 to be his stand-in for his true love. I was coaxed into drinking by his friends until I had a stomach hemorrhage. They asked him,
"Do you feel sorry for her?"
He lowered his eyes and said indifferently,
"She's just a stand-in."
Later, to save his true love, Ernie watched me fall off a cliff into the sea. The rescue team never found my body. Suddenly, he went crazy and searched the world for me. 5 years later, I was invited back to the country and met him at an event. He stared at me intensely, his eyes red.
"I knew you weren't dead. I've been looking for you."
I took a step back and smiled politely but distantly.
Sorry, who are you?
Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. In Ernie's heart, I was just a nominal girlfriend. In fact, I was merely a stand-in for Eve Patton, and a very low-end one at that. After all, she was the noble star adored by everyone. And I came from a humble background. Ernie spent $300,000, which was enough to buy my dignity. The day Eve returned to the country, topics about her were trending. Ernie went to the airport to pick her up for a party. Before leaving, he only left me a single sentence.
"I'm not coming back for dinner tonight."
But after just an hour of reading, he called me again.
"There's a bottle of vintage red wine in the cabinet. Find it and bring it to the restaurant."
Being interrupted just as I got into study mode, I sighed after hanging up the phone but still went to the cabinet to find the wine and drove to deliver it. In the private restaurant room with excellent privacy, the lights were bright, and it was a scene of luxury. In the center were Eve and Ernie, surrounded by admirers. She wore a shimmering silver gown, leaning slightly toward Ernie, looking intimate. Everyone was cheering.
You are finally back. You don't know how long Ernie has been waiting for you.
I walked over and stood in front of Ernie.
I found the wine you wanted by the label. It should be correct.
The originally harmonious atmosphere froze for a moment because of my arrival. After putting down the wine bottle, I turned to leave. Eve spoke faintly behind me.
Stop. Come over and open the wine, pour it for us.
I turned my head and instinctively looked at Ernie. He was wearing a shirt with 2 buttons undone, leaning back in his chair, looking at me indifferently.
"Didn't you understand?"
I understand.
I lowered my eyes.
I'll go find a corkscrew.
As I stepped out, I heard Eve's questioning behind me.
Is this the kind of person you like now?
Ernie remained silent. His friends defended him.
"Don't be mad, Eve. Ernie only has you in his heart. Yeah, you can't blame Ernie. She's the one who keeps clinging to him, and we can't get rid of her."
After pouring the wine, Eve still wouldn't let me go. She held a grudge and made me serve soup and peel shrimp for her, then asked me with a smile.
Which university did you graduate from? Tech University. Such a famous school, didn't they teach you what self-respect and self-love are?
She frowned and suddenly raised her hand, pouring a large bowl of soup on my chest.
Clinging to Ernie shamelessly, aren't you? Are you so eager to climb up the social ladder?
The liquid soaked through my clothes, leaving a burning pain on my skin. Ernie gently held Eve's hand, soothing her without even looking at me.
"I've ordered the pink diamond necklace you like. Don't be mad at me, okay?"
A mischievous friend mixed red, white, and beer into a full glass and pushed it in front of me.
"Drink it, consider it an apology to Eve."
Another person complained.
"Such expensive wine, it's a waste to let her drink it."
In Ernie's circle of friends, Eve was everyone's true love. Because of this, no one respected me, and they all tried to make things difficult and tease me. Ernie never stopped them. Especially this time, in front of Eve. I picked up the cloudy glass of wine and drank it all in one go. The strong burning sensation from the alcohol spread from my throat to my stomach. Tears welled up instantly. I bent over, couldn't help but retch, supporting myself on the table.
"Enough, don't spoil the mood, get out."
Ernie casually picked up a corkscrew and threw it at me. The force wasn't controlled well, and it hit my forehead. After the sharp pain, blood started to flow, running down my cheek. He hesitated, instinctively stood up, and took a step toward me. I covered my forehead, bowed, and quickly ran out. After returning home, I took a shower and simply treated my wounds. Only then did I realize that Ernie had come back too. He didn't look happy. I started to understand.
Did you have a fight with Eve?
Glynis Storm!
He scolded coldly, striding towards me, grabbing my wrist, and pinning me against the bed. I struggled to push him away, but the difference in our strength was like heaven and earth. The lamp shook, and the light stung my eyes, making me instinctively close them, but tears kept streaming down. He paused for a moment, then grabbed my chin, forcing me to lift my face.
Why are you crying? Feeling wronged? Glynis, didn't you say you liked me and that you would accept any identity as long as you could stay by my side?
The kiss on my lips was harsh and fierce. Soon, I tasted the metallic tang of blood. Ernie commanded me.
Forgot what I taught you before? Close your eyes. Your eyes, they look the least like hers.
The pain intensified with his rough movements. In the moment I opened my eyes in confusion, I met his inexplicably dark gaze, as if he was venting some emotion. Suddenly, I understood. I had made Eve unhappy, and Ernie was punishing me. I was overwhelmed by a huge sense of humiliation and hazily recalled the past. When we first met, I was a poor college student with nothing. And he was the high and mighty Mr. Traynor. In the bar where I worked, he got drunk and, looking at my face, got angry.
Don't wear a face similar to hers and do such degrading things here.
Later, my grandmother, who had been my only support, fell ill. I borrowed money from every possible platform but still lacked $300,000. For that $300,000, I sold myself to Ernie Traynor. I threw myself into his arms. The price was that he forbade me from continuing my studies for a master's degree.
A substitute should act like one.
His tone was flat, and with just a few words, he decided my life.
Didn't you say you like me? At least for these 3 years, stay by my side and don't go anywhere.
Eve had left him to study abroad. Ernie wouldn't allow the same thing to happen again. From that day, my dream of furthering my research truly became an unattainable dream. Grandma couldn't survive the post-surgery complications and passed away after 6 months. I was in a daze, sitting in the cemetery all night. In the middle of the night, it started to drizzle. Suddenly, an umbrella appeared over my head. It was Ernie. He looked down at me, his tone unusually gentle.
How long are you going to stay here? I'll stay with you.
We were together for 3 years. I took care of him meticulously. In some moments of our time together, we even had brief periods of warmth. But I knew Ernie actually looked down on me. That time, he was out with a few old friends. I went to pick him up but was stopped by a few of them who were teasing me. They looked me up and down, laughing.
She does look a bit like Eve. Hearing she's a top student at Tech University and even worked on a patent project? Really? Hey, how did you do the project, top student? Why don't you show us here?
I clenched my palms, looking at them.
Research is a very serious matter, not something to joke about.
The man leading the teasing looked at me with disdain.
Stop pretending. You talk about research, but isn't it just to sell yourself for a good price?
A bottle was pushed in front of me.
Not willing? Then drink. Finish this bottle, and Ernie will leave with you.
From start to finish, Ernie leaned on the sofa, playing with a lighter, watching me. Probably because of the alcohol, the usually cold person had a slight smile on his lips and a lazy look in his eyes.
Drink! Let everyone see your drinking capacity!
I was silent for 2 seconds and asked him.
If Eve were standing here today, would you also make her drink?
That day, Ernie got very angry. He snatched the glass from my hand and smashed it on me.
What are you, to even compare yourself to her? She wouldn't be so cheap as to sell herself for $300,000.
I blinked my stinging eyes hard, picking up the rolling glass on the ground.
Fine, I'll drink.
Poor people's lives are worthless, let alone their dignity. Indeed, I took $300,000 from him. This is what I deserved. Before Eve went abroad, she was already a popular A-list actress. This time, she came back with even more fame, and movie offers were pouring in. She called and said she had just returned and needed a good assistant.
I think that Glynis by your side looks pretty good. Seems like she knows how to take care of people.
Ernie was silent for 2 seconds. She chuckled softly.
What? Can't bear to let her go?
No.
Ernie said calmly.
Since you need her, I'll let her go over.
I followed Eve into the film crew. During a break, the second female lead, Johnny, came over and started a conversation.
Eve, your assistant looks quite a bit like you. Except for the eyes. She has a tear mole, makes her look even more charming than you.
Johnny was originally set to be the lead actress in this film, but unfortunately, Eve's return disrupted everything, and she directly took over her role. Johnny was unhappy about it and said this deliberately to provoke Eve. Sure enough, Eve's face changed, and the look she gave me was filled with undisguised hatred. After wrapping up in the afternoon, she said she had lost her ring.
It was still there when we were filming by the lake, it must have fallen into the water.
Her gaze shifted and finally settled on me.
Glynis, go into the lake and help me find it.
The artificial lake wasn't deep, just barely reaching my waist. I soaked in the water, bending down, and groped through the silt at the bottom bit by bit. The sunset on the horizon was blood red. As night fell, the light gradually dimmed. Knowing that Eve was deliberately making things difficult for me, everyone stood by the shore watching silently. No one would stand up for an unknown small assistant. My fingers turned white and wrinkled from the cold lake water, and mud fell off as I lifted them. Suddenly, I thought of my university days. I soaked in the lab, working on my graduation project. My hands had to be kept dry and clean, picking up test tubes, petri dishes, and slides, observing results, and recording data. Senior sisters and mentors all said I was a very talented student and would go far on this path. But an ordinary person's life can't withstand any turbulence. Just a little setback can destroy everything. It had only been 3 years, yet it felt like a lifetime ago. Finally, when it was completely dark, the stylist spoke up.
Eve, your ring was found, it's on the table in the makeup room. Maybe I accidentally left it there.
Eve took the ring and casually threw it into her Hermes bag.
Come up, Glynis, clean yourself up, don't make it look like I'm bullying you.
After wrapping up, Ernie would come to pick her up. I sat drenched under a few pear trees outside the set. I didn't know how long had passed when that black Rolls-Royce returned. Ernie got out of the car and walked over to me.
Go home and change your clothes.
I didn't look up. He softened his tone slightly.
Don't blame Eve, she's just upset and needed to vent a bit.
Seeing that I still didn't respond, Ernie lost his patience.
Enough, Glynis, who are you throwing a tantrum at?
I sniffed, holding back my tears, and looked up at him.
Ernie, it's been 3 years, and now Eve is back too. Let me go.
His face changed slightly.
Where do you want to go?
I picked up the canvas bag beside me and took out a document from it.
I applied to a top foreign university for a graduate program in biological sciences, and they've already sent me an acceptance letter.
Before I finished speaking, Ernie suddenly snatched those pages and tore them to pieces. He grabbed my wet wrist and pushed me into the car. His hot palm pressed against my cold arm, and the warmth gradually spread. Under the dim car lights, Ernie looked at me with a chilling gaze.
Don't even think about it, you are not going anywhere. Glynis, you are my girlfriend.
After that day, I didn't go back to the set. Ernie found a new assistant for Eve, and then he arranged for me to work in his company as his personal assistant.
From now on, you'll follow me.
He played with the pen in his hand, looked up at me, and softened his tone slightly.
That day on the set, it was that Johnny who deliberately stirred up trouble between you and Eve. I've already spoken to someone, and no one will hire her for acting anymore.
Seeing that I had no expression and didn't respond, Ernie's face darkened. With a warning tone, he said,
Glynis Storm, don't push your luck.
Am I the one pushing my luck? Johnny was just upset about losing a role and deliberately provoked Eve with a few words. The real culprit was clear to both Ernie and me. However, because I angered him that day, he ignored my drenched state and deliberately tormented me in the car for a long time. I've had a low fever for the past few days. After taking medicine, I felt drowsy and didn't have the energy to argue with him. I just lowered my head slightly.
I understand.
In the evening, after Eve finished work, I drove Ernie to have dinner with her. As soon as she saw me, she said coldly,
Ernie, I don't want to argue with you, and don't bring anything that spoils my mood.
Ernie turned his head and glanced at me.
You wait in the car.
I nodded, turned around, and left. On my phone was an email from the professor at the university I applied to.
Glynis Storm, the admission notice has been mailed to you. When can you come to the university to report? After reviewing your resume, I have applied for the highest scholarship for you. I'm looking forward to teaching such a talented and hardworking student like you.
I clasped my hands in the air. It felt like I could catch those fragments of the admission letter that Ernie had torn and discarded. That night, Ernie didn't come home. He sent me a message.
I'm taking Eve home, don't wait for me.
Are you staying there overnight?
He was blunt.
Glynis, this is not something you have the right to ask about.
I drove to the suburban cemetery. My grandmother was buried there. It had been over 2 years. The photo embedded in the tombstone was taken during her final days. At that time, she was gravely ill. The money I had saved over the years by scrimping and saving, the money I had borrowed from teachers and classmates with shame. Even combined, it was still more than 300,000 short. For Ernie, that was just the cost of a night out drinking with friends. A bag for his female companion. But for me, it was an insurmountable chasm. After the surgery, my grandmother held my hand and repeatedly reminded me, just because this money was insignificant to Ernie, we shouldn't dismiss it. So for the past 3 years, I have obeyed Ernie, agreeing to even the most unreasonable demands.
But should I continue to waste the rest of my life, my ideals and pursuits, here?
The cemetery was empty, with only the sound of the wind and insects. My grandmother on the tombstone looked at me silently. She would never answer me again. That afternoon, a familiar person suddenly found me. It was Johnny. She no longer had the pride she showed when confronting Eve on set, and her whole demeanor was one of disarray. She sat in the corner of the CAF and asked me,
Eve treated you like that, you must be very angry, right? I know, you worked so hard to climb up to Ernie, but the moment she came back, everything was ruined. I got photos of her and Ernie spending the night together. Once they are exposed, you just need to come out and say that you are the legitimate girlfriend, and she will be destroyed. The supposedly pure white Jasmine is actually a shameless homewrecker.
I finished a whole glass of lemon water, shook my head, and refused her. But I underestimated Johnny's madness. Her most proud acting career was easily destroyed by Ernie, and she had lost her sanity. That night, intimate photos of Eve and Ernie hit the trending searches. An insider revealed, Ernie has a girlfriend, they have been together for several years. I have seen them eating together, and that person is definitely not Eve. To prove her words, she even posted a photo. Because it was taken secretly, the quality was a bit blurry, but you could still see that the woman in the photo had short hair, a slender figure, and a tear mole at the corner of her eye. She was looking up, her eyes shining as she looked at the man across from her. I stared at the photo, somewhat dazed. This was 2 years ago, not long after my grandmother passed away. I had been in a bad mood. Ernie took me to a newly opened niche restaurant. There, they served the home-style dishes from my hometown. The seasonings used were exactly the same as my grandmother's habits for decades. I took a bite, knowing he had brought me here on purpose, so I looked up and thanked him seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Traynor.
He smiled slightly and said, Glynis, is that how you address your boyfriend?
He wanted me to call him Ernie. I couldn't get used to such intimacy, so I could only call him by his full name. Later, I found out that this was how Eve had addressed him since childhood.
Glynis.
I snapped back to reality and saw Ernie walking with a stern face, striding towards me. He raised his hand and slapped me, then grabbed my collar and pushed me to the edge of the table. A photo was forcefully thrown in front of me. In it, Johnny and I were sitting in the dimly lit corner of the CAF. His voice was icy.
What more do you want? If it wasn't for this face resembling Eve's to some extent, when your grandmother was lying in the hospital, you wouldn't even have had the right to sell yourself to me for money. And now, you conspire with others to frame Eve. How could you be such a vicious woman?
The burning pain on my cheek, the collar tightening around my neck, the feeling of suffocation surged up. I opened my mouth with difficulty.
It's not me. I refused her.
Ernie refused to believe it. He gripped my chin tightly, scrutinizing my face as if he wanted to gouge out a piece of flesh with his eyes. After a while, he sneered.
Third-rate trash, truly despicable.
He let go, watching me collapse weakly to the ground, and slammed the door as he left. The trending topic quickly changed direction. Ernie's friend came forward to clarify, saying I wasn't his girlfriend.
Mr. Traynor initially felt sorry for her, so he helped her family with medical expenses. Little did he know she would cling to him endlessly, always trying to offer herself to climb up the social ladder. The dinner in the photo was just Mr. Traynor trying to clear things up with her.
Ernie released a few photos. There were pictures of me working at a bar, being harassed by customers. But from the angle they were taken, it looked like I was playing hard to get. There were also photos of Johnny having dinner with an investor. Lastly, there was a photo of the two of us in a CAF. Some people concluded, so Johnny's role was taken, and she harbored resentment, teaming up with this nightclub girl to fabricate rumors? Eve is so pitiful. My phone number was exposed. Thousands of abusive messages flooded in. Some even dug up my documents, demanding the school revoke my graduation and degree certificates on the grounds of moral corruption. Meanwhile, Eve cleanly extricated herself from the storm of public opinion. The next evening, she gracefully posted a photo of a diamond ring on her Twitter.
Engaged.
In the comments section, countless people offered their congratulations. The online abuse against me intensified. For several days, I didn't dare to turn on my phone. Ernie never came back. My stomach ailment flared up again, and I planned to go to the hospital to get some medicine. But I was tied up and thrown into a white van. In an abandoned factory by the sea, I saw Eve, also tied up. Her expensive long dress was stained with dust, becoming tattered and torn. Her meticulously groomed, silky long hair was now a tangled mess like dry grass. She glared at me with hatred, cursing.
It's you again.
I pressed my lips together.
I should be the one saying that. What right do you have to talk to me like that? You pauper.
Eve screamed.
Ernie doesn't love you at all. If you didn't look like me, you wouldn't even have the right to stay by his side as a stand-in.
She lost her composure. The always high and mighty actress was dragged here in the most brutal way, locked in a dusty factory. She couldn't even get a sip of clean water. She cursed, threatened, and tried to bribe, only to be met with punches and kicks from the kidnappers. After 2 days, Johnny appeared. I sighed.
I guessed it was you.
She looked at me with a smile.
You see, you think about Ernie, but he doesn't consider your situation. Now that you and Eve are both here, if only one person can be saved, I'm curious who he will choose.
The answer to this question didn't need to be tested. So when the sound of police sirens approached, Johnny and her hired men hurriedly pushed me to the edge of the cliff. I just looked calmly at Ernie. He didn't even look at me, only at Eve.
Eve, don't be afraid.
The always proud Eve shed tears. She sobbed, calling Ernie's name over and over.
Save me, Ernie.
I looked at the white waves crashing below the cliff without saying a word. Johnny asked me,
Aren't you going to struggle? No.
I said softly.
I'm a bit tired.
They seemed to say something else, probably negotiating terms. My stomach hurt more and more, cold sweat covered my forehead and back layer by layer, and finally, I heard Ernie's voice. He called me.
Glynis. I will save you too, look at me. Lift your head, look at me.
I didn't lift my head, only hearing Johnny's cold laugh.
There's no such good thing. Ernie Traynor, I've worked hard for so many years to get here, and you ruined it all. You'll pay the price.
Suddenly, a force pushed me from behind. My body became light, then I felt the weightlessness of falling, the white waves getting closer and closer. Eve's screams became fainter and fainter. I realized belatedly that she pushed both Eve and me off. Before being swallowed by the sea, I heard Ernie call me one last time. With unprecedented fear and despair in his voice.
Glynis.
Ernie Traynor's perspective. The third day after Glynis fell into the sea. The secretary called and said the search and rescue team still hadn't found her. The best rescue time had passed, and she was likely in grave danger.
Miss Patton has come from the hospital and is waiting outside.
She hesitated, looking at Ernie.
Do you want to see her?
He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing at the darkening sky outside, and after a while, he spoke.
No, let her go back and rest.
As soon as he finished speaking, Eve pushed the door open and walked in, looking at him coldly.
What do you mean by this? Are you blaming Glynis's death on me?
Her cheekbone had a scratch, and there was a long cut on her arm, which was still wrapped in bandages. But compared to Glynis, who was now missing and possibly dead, these injuries were minor. Ernie avoided her gaze, his tone indifferent.
No, you should go back and rest.
Eve didn't leave. She stood there, her eyes red, looking at him.
Are you regretting it?
Regretting what?
Regretting getting engaged to me, regretting that the person you grabbed that day wasn't her.
Ernie pressed his lips together and said nothing. Eve immediately understood.
Ernie, get it straight. She was just a lowly substitute who sold herself for money.
She held her Hermes bag, wearing a pink diamond ring, her entire outfit worth over $1 million. By some strange coincidence, Ernie thought of the first time he saw Glynis. In a dimly lit bar, amidst the chaos of flashing lights, she was wearing a faded shirt, with her hair cut short. A customer, intending to tease, stuffed a tip into her collar. She calmly took it out and carefully put it in her pocket, even thanking the person. In those eyes, it seemed like there was a fire burning. Including later. For $300,000, she actively approached him, throwing herself into his arms. When he heard gossip about Eve, he was furious and deliberately tormented Glynis in their intimate moments. Many times, when she bent her back, the fire in her eyes might have dimmed briefly, but it never went out. Ernie admitted that he initially looked down on Glynis. Their lives were as distant as two different worlds. That first chaotic night, he almost pressed her down to vent his emotions. Glynis endured it silently, only in the dim, flickering light, her eyelashes trembling violently, as if she was enduring immense pain. The next morning, she asked him if she could borrow some money.
Just consider it a loan to me.
Ernie felt even more contempt. At least none of the women he had been with before had been so eager to reveal their intentions.
Even so, he still asked, how much?
$300,000. After saying this, she paused for a moment and then added somewhat awkwardly, if you could add a few more thousand, that would be great, as a backup.
His pen paused on the check paper. Suddenly, it felt absurd. The breakup fee he casually threw to his previous girlfriend was more than 10 times what Glynis was asking for. He should have realized then that she was different from those people. She approached him not out of greed for vanity, but because she had no other choice. Later, he discovered many scars on Glynis, some deep, some shallow. She didn't care much, saying that when she was a child, she had to walk on mountain roads to school, and sometimes she would fall when it rained, leaving scars. Ernie had thought countless times that the sudden pain in his heart at that moment was actually the beginning of his feelings for her. But he forcibly ignored it. He had liked Eve for so many years, she was like a flower always carefully protected, unstained by any dust, proud and arrogant as she should be. And Glynis. She was like clear lake water. She always silently followed him, accepting the deliberate difficulties from him and his friends without complaint. The more they looked down on her, the more those bright eyes reflected their baseness and disgrace. Sometimes, Ernie would feel restless. Because he felt he never truly had her. She stayed by his side only because of the ridiculous kindness brought by that $300,000. He knew she would secretly read books where he couldn't see, as if she was always preparing to leave him. That eager, passionate look when she read, he had never seen it directed at him for even a second. He just wanted Glynis's eyes to hold him, even if it was with dislike or hatred. So one wrong step led to another. On the 10th day after Glynis fell off the cliff, everyone said she couldn't have survived. Friends advised him.
Let it go, it's already like this, don't cause trouble with Eve over a dead person. Besides, didn't you say she was just a substitute?
Ernie looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. Eve was crying beside him. She questioned him.
The news about Johnny going to prison has already been released. If you announce the cancellation of the engagement now, aren't you telling everyone that you were just acting with me? Ernie, don't you care about my career?
At this time, she still called him Ernie. With a gentle, plaintive tone, her eyes filled with a pitiful look. Ernie suddenly realized that Glynis had never called him by such an intimate nickname. At first, she called him Mr. Traynor, and later, under his orders, she only took it a step further, calling him by his full name. Polite and distant to the extreme. Ernie began to dream about Glynis frequently. In the dreams, he didn't humiliate or look down on her, didn't use gratitude to keep her by his side. So her attitude towards him gradually softened, and she was willing to let down her guard and call him Ernie. He went to pick her up from the research institute, hiding a large bouquet of roses in the car. She was a bit surprised to receive the flowers and finally gave him a sincere smile. But when he woke up, there was nothing. On the bedside table were the books Glynis had read, the papers she had written, and the research results she had quietly worked on. That was her world, and he had never been a part of it. 3 years passed like this. One day, he saw in the news, at a foreign scientific research conference, a vaguely familiar figure in the corner. Ernie stood up in shock, almost thinking he was still dreaming. He had someone investigate, and the reply came quickly. That person wasn't named Glynis Storm but was a PhD student in biology at a foreign university. It felt like falling from a warm, illusory dream. Ernie stared silently out the window for a long time. Then he said, word by word,
She is still alive.
Glynis's body had never been found. That meant she still had a chance of survival, no matter how slim. Ernie began searching the world for her, starting from that cliff. Where did the currents of that sea lead? Who had been there? The nearby hospitals, big and small. Time and again, hope flared up, only to see it shattered before his eyes. The repeated cycle of hope and despair was driving him mad. For 2 whole years, he found nothing. But he still held a sliver of hope, still waiting. Waiting for the day she would appear before him. Perhaps out of hatred and revenge, but that didn't matter. The plane slid onto the landing track. After a brief moment of ear pressure, I removed my eye mask and took my suitcase from the overhead compartment. The hotel was arranged by the event organizers, and the conference hall was just downstairs. When I arrived, quite a few people were already there. Darcy and I had worked on a project together before, so we were fairly familiar with each other. She asked me,
Did you know? Several big bosses are also invited today. I heard there are project investments and some business aspects.
Before she could finish, someone nearby greeted enthusiastically.
Mr. Traynor is here too!
Ernie nodded slightly.
Yes, I'm here to take a look.
Darcy saw him and changed the subject.
See that person? That's Ernie Traynor. He originally worked in the entertainment and IT industries, but in the past 2 years, for some reason, he started investing in biological and pharmaceutical projects.
I smiled.
Really?
She nodded and continued gossiping.
Yes, do you know his fiancée? Eve Patton. She used to be a very popular top actress, but a couple of years ago, she went for plastic surgery for some reason.
While she was talking, Ernie and the people around him had already walked up to us. Mr. Traynor, this is our specially invited guest returning from the States, Dr. Hilda Woosley from the University of Michigan, specializing in cell biology. Under the bright crystal chandelier, Ernie's indifferent gaze swept over and suddenly fixed on my face. Everyone around us keenly sensed something was off. He seemed unaware, just staring at me with reddened eyes.
I knew you weren't dead. I've been looking for you.
I took a step back to avoid his outstretched hand.
Sorry, who are you?
The atmosphere became tense. Finally, staff members came over to smooth things over and politely escorted him away. Ernie sat in the VIP section, his gaze never leaving me through the crowd. Darcy curiously asked,
Do you know Mr. Traynor? No.
I curled my lips.
Maybe he mistook me for someone else.
The event proceeded smoothly. Finally, the staff from the Bright City Life Sciences Research Institute announced the list of specially appointed PhDs, and my name was prominently listed. Hilda Woosley. I went on stage to give a brief speech, and for a moment, my eyes met Ernie's in midair.
For the next few years, I will be staying in Bright City. I hope to have academic exchanges with my peers here.
I bowed and stepped down, returning to my seat next to Darcy. She suddenly slapped her thigh.
I remember now. Hilda, you look quite similar to Ernie's fiancée, Eve Patton, before her plastic surgery. He probably mistook you for her.
I finally smiled genuinely.
I think so too.
After the event, I wasn't surprised to see Ernie's Rolls-Royce downstairs at the hotel. He leaned against the car, looking at me almost longingly.
Glynis.
I nodded politely.
Mr. Traynor.
A flash of pain crossed his eyes.
You hate me, don't you?
Don't think that way, Mr. Traynor.
I sighed.
If there's nothing else, I'll be going.
Don't go.
He reached out and grabbed the hem of my clothes, his voice trembling, almost pleading.
That day at the cliff, it wasn't that I didn't want to save you, it was just that I instinctively grabbed Eve. Later, I sent people down to find you. They all said that cliff was very steep, and with your hands tied, you were probably doomed. But that day, I saw you on the news.
I glanced at my watch. Time was running out, and I didn't want to spend my second day back listening to his heartfelt confession by the roadside. So I smiled politely and interrupted him.
Sorry, I have something to do. I need to go.
He asked.
Where are you going?
Just then, a bright orange Porsche pulled up nearby. The driver got out and opened the door.
Boss has already reserved a restaurant. I'm here to take you there.
Ernie's face turned pale instantly. He watched me get into the car, and just as the door was about to close, he suddenly reached out to stop it and asked,
Who is boss?
This doesn't seem to concern you, does it?
I tugged at the corners of my lips, my eyes falling on the Rolls-Royce behind him, unable to resist a jab.
After all these years, Mr. Traynor, not changing your car doesn't quite match your status, does it?
As the car drove away, I could still see him standing there silently, looking at me through the rearview mirror. In the Air Garden restaurant at the city's center, Marie Woosley was waiting for me. She leaned back in her wheelchair, lazily looking at me.
You saw Ernie Traynor?
I briefly recounted the events, ending with a self-reflection.
That last sentence, I think I was a bit harsh. Harsh? I think it wasn't harsh enough.
She flipped through the menu, casually ordered 2 dishes, and then handed the menu to me.
Next time you see him, remember to say it again. Ernie Traynor, you're just third rate. Don't be so cheap.
I propped myself up on the table.
You really dislike him. Of course, I do. While you were abroad doing your master's and PhD, I was here competing with him, snatching several projects from him. Every time you had a corrective surgery, I arranged a black-hot search for Eve Patton.
She smiled with narrowed eyes.
You don't hold grudges, but I am very vindictive.
The warm yellow light shone on her face, her eyes sparkling with brilliance, her expression sharp. When I first met Marie, she was like this. Despite her disabled legs and being in a wheelchair, she showed no signs of despondency. She smiled and said,
I was the one who had you fished out. You're really smart. Before being pushed down, you cut the rope yourself, but left a bit, so no one noticed your little trick. Now Ernie has hired a search and rescue team, combing that area for your body. If it weren't for my yacht being nearby, how long would you have had to swim to shore?
I was soaking wet, wrapped in a towel, and said softly,
I would swim however long it took.
As long as it got me away from Ernie, it was worth it. She swirled her wine glass, slowly drinking a whole glass of red wine, then asked me,
Shall I help you?
I emailed my advisor saying that I lost the admission notice. He said it didn't matter, as long as I showed up in person. Marie helped me change my name, got a new ID card for me, and then took me to the hospital. On my wrist were tiny scars from when I used a knife to cut the rope, and my arm was fractured from the fall. My cheek had been scraped heavily against the rocks, almost down to the bone. I underwent several surgeries afterward to repair the damage. Each recovery period was long and painful. When I first returned to campus, I couldn't adapt to that life anymore. During the 3 years I stayed by Ernie's side, he and his friends trampled on my self-esteem and dreams, crushed them, and mocked me without restraint. They didn't even consider me an equal human being. I often had nightmares, dreaming of Ernie throwing things at my face after seeing Eve's scandalous news. Pressing me down amidst the mess, he vented his anger without any mercy. I dreamed of his friends forcing me to drink until I vomited blood-streaked stomach acid. He just looked at me coldly and said,
Useless.
That was not the life I wanted. It never would be. I poured all my energy into academic research, spending holidays and weekends in the lab and library. As a result, my advisor often marveled during group meetings, telling my senior and junior peers that he had never seen a more hardworking student than me. But in the midst of such busyness and exhaustion, my long-floating heart finally felt grounded. 2 years ago, I knew that Ernie was looking for me. Many times, the leads he followed were cut off by Marie. She told me,
Focus on your studies, pursue your dreams and career, I'll handle the rest.
I once asked her why.
Marie was silent for a long time, then asked me, do you know how my leg was broken?
She was 10 years older than me. In her youth, she had her own dreams. Her parents handed the family business to her brother but forced her into a marriage alliance when the company faced a crisis. In the end, she said lightly,
Since a bunch of useless people who need me to sacrifice myself to save the company might as well let me take over.
Her leg was broken when her enraged brother pushed her down the stairs. That night, she and I sat facing each other on the balcony. She covered the back of my hand, sighed softly, and said,
I wish I'd met you earlier. At least you wouldn't have wasted 3 precious years of your life on him for a mere $300,000.
This time when I returned to the country, I had a patent project with me. The research institute offered me an annual salary of $900,000. It was a figure that the young Glynis Storm, who had been at a loss, never dared to dream of. 5 years later, I calmly accepted the offer, signed the contract, then bought some red wine to celebrate with Marie. She drank wine, I drank milk. My recurring stomach problems had made me quit alcohol completely. I held my glass of milk and thanked her. She said,
Nothing to thank me for. I just saw my younger self in you.
After dinner, I said goodbye to Marie. Half jokingly, she pointed at the Porsche and asked me,
Wouldn't it be convenient if I gave you a car to commute with? Do you really not want it?
I smiled.
The Research Institute arranged a single apartment for me, and it's just across the street from the institute. Why would I need a car?
She pouted.
All right then, call me if you need anything.
I had only been at the Research Institute for a couple of days when Ernie came again. He found me in the cafeteria and sat down across from me, staring at the corner of my right eye for a long time. After a moment, he softly asked,
Where's the tear mole?
Oh.
I responded casually.
I got hurt when I fell off a cliff, and later I had reconstructive surgery. My face doesn't look the same as before.
His hand on the table suddenly started to tremble. He asked me,
Did it hurt?
This was an utterly absurd question. I put down my chopsticks, looked up, and calmly stared at him.
Ernie, no matter what, this is not a question you should be asking. I remember very clearly the pain I endured during the 3 years I was with you, even though you might have forgotten.
Abusers always easily forget and overlook the harm they've caused others. Looking into Ernie's eyes, I kindly counted on my fingers for him.
That time I had a fever, and Eve happened to call you from abroad. You got angry and took it out on me. You even said that holding me when I had a fever was more comfortable.
When I went out with you, your friends made me drink until I vomited blood.
You made me take a taxi to the hospital by myself, and because no one was there to sign for me, I had to undergo a gastroscopy without anesthesia. Eve was slandered by Johnny, and you said it was all my doing. You called me trash and slapped me twice. There were many other times, but I got used to it. So, having reconstructive surgery on my wounds wasn't very painful.
With each sentence I spoke, his face grew paler. In the end, the always aloof and noble Ernie shed tears in front of me. I felt a bit embarrassed and glanced around. Luckily, the cafeteria wasn't crowded, and we were sitting in a corner, so not many people saw us.
I'm sorry, Glynis. At that time, I didn't understand my own feelings.
He spoke with some difficulty.
Johnny and those who kidnapped you have been sentenced. My engagement to Eve will also be annulled. I know she made things difficult for you on set back then.
I sneered.
Was Johnny or Eve really the mastermind? You know the truth, Ernie Traynor. The distance between domestic and abroad isn't an insurmountable chasm. With your wealth, it would be easy to visit or even move to live with her for a few years. If you truly loved Eve, there are countless ways to be with her instead of finding a companion, a stand-in, as you call it. You don't love her that much, and you can't stand loneliness. So you always need someone by your side. But you look down on those who accompany you, so you find ways to humiliate them to satisfy yourself.
He stared at me blankly, speechless. In the end, with reddened eyes, he could only say,
But Glynis, I really love you now. I know I've done many things to hurt you. Give me a chance, and I will love you wholeheartedly and make it up to you.
I sighed, feeling he was beyond redemption.
You already have so much, yet you waste it on unfulfilling love and hate. Don't you understand? I've never liked you or had any feelings for you. I willingly stayed by your side because you did help me financially. But after that incident where I was caught in the crossfire and fell off a cliff, I believe I've repaid everything.
I stood up with my tray, and Ernie suddenly grabbed my hand. He stammered.
What do you need? Just give me a chance. Research funding, project investment, even, I'll build you a separate lab so you can work independently, without any constraints. How about that?
He was truly insufferable.
Don't be pathetic, Ernie Traynor.
I completely lost my patience and violently shook off his hand. The soup in my tray spilled, splashing onto his expensive suit. I pursed my lips and coldly looked at him.
How much is the dry cleaning fee? Let your assistant bring the receipt to the institute, and I'll reimburse it.
He was a mess, like a lost dog, the light in his eyes completely dimmed. No room for reconciliation. A few days after Ernie left, Eve found me. She glared at me with near hatred.
I thought you were dead. All these years, he tried multiple times to break off our engagement, but I refused every time. So he punished me by getting drunk and calling out your name, saying that you are the one he truly loves. Glynis Storm, how dare you make me your substitute?
I looked at her face, now completely altered, with an undeniable weariness and the restlessness of a trapped beast. For some inexplicable reason, I thought of when she had just returned. High and mighty, the center of attention. Making me pour her wine and serve her soup. With a casual remark, I had to soak in the cold artificial lake to find a non-existent ring for her. After all the twists and turns, she ended up being tormented like this. Seeing me calmly watching her, Eve suddenly broke down. She stood up abruptly, glaring at me fiercely.
Why did you come back? Since you left, don't come back again. Do you know that as soon as you returned, Ernie insisted on breaking off our engagement? He said he wanted to pursue you cleanly and ask for a chance from you. I went abroad to study, did scientific research, and then brought my results back to continue my studies, contributing to the country and the people. I don't think that's wrong.
I stirred the coffee in front of me, my tone indifferent.
Miss Patton, it's your narrow-mindedness, confining your thoughts to useless love and hate. What right do you have to question me?
She glared at me with resentment but couldn't say a word. Eve Patton and Ernie Traynor are the same kind of people. From birth, they had everything, lacking nothing. In their view, not loving each other is the greatest misfortune. But what I have always wanted is just the path to my ideals. I ignored Eve, paid for the coffee, and left. Unexpectedly, that night, I saw myself trending on social media. She, like Johnny back then, was best at using public opinion as a weapon. In that long post, she and Ernie were long-time engaged, and I was the villain who returned to steal him away. Those who couldn't find me went to the Institute's official account, leaving comments demanding my dismissal. No matter how educated, a person with a bad character cannot hold an important research position. This time, the public opinion was overwhelming. Some extreme fans even went to the Institute's entrance with banners. I called the police directly. Marie was furious.
What right does a plastic surgery freak have to jump around?
I stopped her.
This time, I'll handle it myself.
Some things, just because I didn't mention them back then, doesn't mean I didn't keep evidence. I registered an account and posted a video. Back then on set, Eve and Johnny had a conflict, and unhappy, she forced me into the water to find a ring. There was actually another equally obscure, often bullied assistant on site who recorded the scene and secretly sent the video to me. She said,
If she bullies you again, expose it. These people, elevated by fans, don't see us as humans.
5 years ago, I didn't expose it. Because I knew the root of the problem was never Eve, but Ernie. But this time, she came for me. After the video was released, public opinion was in an uproar. Because that video was really complete and clear. Soon, Ernie also stood up and admitted that when he was with Eve, he was indeed in a relationship with me. In other words, Eve was the third party who tried to turn the tables. Her reputation plummeted, and all her film contracts and commercial endorsements were terminated. As for Ernie's company, its stock price plummeted. He didn't care and called me in the middle of the night.
Glynis, what else do you want to do to vent your anger, or can you return all the things I did to you back to me?
I chuckled lightly.
Forget it. Now, just being in contact with you makes me feel dirty.
He didn't seem to care about my sarcasm at all. The next day at the research institute, the leader told me that the funding for the biological project I was leading had doubled, and the source was Ernie's private sponsorship. I was about to refuse when he winked at me.
Since it's funding, how to allocate it is entirely up to you. Besides, this is Mr. Traynor's support for our scientific research project, which has nothing to do with personal feelings.
Old fox. I smiled and accepted his proposal. Ernie started driving over every day, waiting at the research institute's entrance, not caring if I ignored him. That afternoon, he even called over his past friends. Several well-dressed men stood at the door, bowing to me and saying sorry. The experimental data had gone wrong these past few days, and I was already in a bad mood. The curious glances from colleagues and passers-by made me feel even more embarrassed. I finally couldn't hold back my anger.
Ernie Traynor, are you sick?
He looked at me with a pained expression.
Glynis, I just want to apologize for my past behavior.
There's no need.
I looked at him expressionlessly.
I have my own life and work now. Just don't come to bother me anymore. And take care of Eve. Your relationship problems are yours to solve.
Ernie didn't really like me. It was just that I fell into the sea in front of him but survived. That became an obsession for him, as if getting me would prove something. Just like Eve back then. I glanced at him and his friends, then suddenly said,
Do you remember? When I went to the bar to pick you up, your friends wouldn't let me leave and insisted I demonstrate my research project. I heard from Mr. Wilson that you donated funding for my current research project. Well then, you're welcome to bring your friends to the lab to see how I record data and advance the project.
After 8 years, I finally retaliated openly for their mockery back then. Ernie looked at me in pain, his eyelashes trembling, almost unable to speak. At dusk, the glow in the sky gradually dimmed. The autumn wind blew the fallen leaves, swirling them between us. Ernie and I stood face to face, no longer in the humble and pleading posture of the past. He took a deep breath and asked me with difficulty.
If from the beginning, when we first met, I treated you with equal respect, lent you money when you needed it, and didn't stop you from continuing your studies, would you have possibly liked me?
I answered without hesitation, I would be very grateful to you, would repay the money as soon as possible, and provide help within my capabilities in the future.
As for liking or not, that was never an option in my life. I hadn't seen Ernie for a long time. The next time I heard about him was actually on the news. Eve was having a hard time, her family was putting pressure on Ernie to marry her. Ernie refused no matter what, and when he got fed up, he drove out to clear his mind. But his brakes failed on the mountain road, and he fell off a cliff. When they rescued him, he was covered in blood and had fallen into a deep coma. The police investigated and eventually traced it back to Eve. She admitted it.
Yes, it was me. He was the one who came after me first. Why should he leave me for a poor fake?
The once celebrated actress had now fallen into the dirt, completely losing her composure.
If I can't have it good, then neither can he.
Some of Ernie's friends came to me, asking me to visit him in the hospital. I refused outright.
I don't think that's necessary, is it?
He glared at me angrily.
Do you even know what Ernie did for you?
Of course.
I smiled and said,
Was it bringing me to your gatherings to let you all get me drunk and make fun of me, or releasing misleading photos to humiliate me for Eve?
His face changed dramatically, and he was left speechless. The experimental project went through many ups and downs, but in the end, it yielded results smoothly. When we held the results press conference, Ernie was still lying in the hospital, unconscious. After it ended, I went to the cemetery again. Grandma was still on the tombstone, smiling kindly at me. I exhaled, watching the white mist disperse into the cold air. Actually, back then, when Grandma was on her deathbed, she had held Ernie's hand, asking him to be good to me. She said,
I know Glynis borrowed $300,000 from you because of my illness. It was my fault. Don't blame her, she has had a tough time all these years, enduring so much hardship.
Her withered hand, due to the effort, showed veins popping out. She was finding it increasingly difficult to speak.
Be good to her.
Ernie was silent for a while before he agreed. Only then did Grandma pass away peacefully. I lay on her body, almost unable to make a sound, just continuously shedding tears. When I inadvertently looked up, I saw Ernie frowning and wiping his hands with disinfectant wipes. He never respected me, nor did he respect the poor people struggling to survive in this world. But now, it was his turn.
My experimental results are gradually being put to use, and soon I'll be involved in the next project. Maybe in many years, I will be a renowned biologist remembered in history. By then, you will surely be happy for me, right?
I leaned against Grandma's tombstone, talking for a long time. Until the sky was completely dark, I got up and left. Marie was waiting at the gate. She had specially arranged for a black car to pick me up. After getting in the car, my frozen body gradually regained feeling.
She asked me, now that Ernie is lying in the hospital, and it's all over, do you want to change your name back?
I thought for a moment.
All right.
Glynis Storm was the name Grandma gave me. I still hope that if my name is recorded in history books in the future, it will be this one. That night, the sky was cloudless, and the moonlight was bright. Shadows of trees and streetlights passed by outside the car window. I was finally back on the path I had pursued for many years. This time, I wouldn't stop again.